Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be able to present to you this project, as John said, that we are doing, corporately, that we're joining together because we need one another. There's power in Christian union. That we've entitled Watchmen on the Walls, Ministry and Civil Duties. There we go. And as John said, this is a project that we at the Providence Foundation, that Wall Builders, David Barton, and the National Day of Prayer are joining into. And it's based upon this scripture that you're familiar with from Isaiah, where he declares, "I have posted watchmen on your walls, O Jerusalem. They will never be silent day or night." Now, of course, the function of the watchman was to be posted on the walls of the city to take a look for the enemy. And if the enemy began to come, they were to sound the alarm, to awaken the people, to let them know that we've got problems. The enemy is here. Now, I don't know if you can recognize this picture. It's actually the picture we have on the cover of one of our books that we wrote some 15 years ago, called Watchmen on the Walls, Pastors Equipping Christians for Their Civil Duties. And in this particular case, here's the watchman with the trumpet in his hand, asleep on the walls. And if you look in the background, the horde of the enemy is swarming in to take over the city. Now, unfortunately, this is the situation that the United States of America has been in, and other nations as well. The watchmen, those people that God has called to leadership in every sphere of life, who are supposed to sound the alarm or recognize who the enemy is, how the enemy is coming in, has fallen asleep. In this nation where God's people built the walls in the first place, they constructed the city, they constructed its forms of government, its educational institutions, its economic institutions. These watchmen have fallen asleep, and others who have different ideas have swarmed into the city. And that is why we find a great assault against God's and the truth today. You're all aware of the assault against God in schools, where God is unconstitutional. We can't pray or post the 10 Commandments. In the civil arena, we've heard about the assault against the National Day of Prayer. Some try to making it unconstitutional. We know of the attack against God in the courtrooms with Judge Roy Moore and others, where they've ruled you can't hang the 10 Commandments on the walls of the courtroom, which, by the way, our civil law in the Western civilization was built upon God's 10 Commands, but that doesn't matter. And in government, where God is being separated from this very divine institution that he gave birth to for our good and well-being, for redefining the family. And there's even assault against truth itself, which, by the way, has made quite a few inroads, because as a poll Barna release said, only 1/3 of born-again Christians claim that there's absolute truth. So in other words, we are aware of the assault that has come today. Why have the ungodly been effective in removing God from the public life of our nation? It's because the watchmen have fallen asleep. Now, as I mentioned, in early America, God's people were watchmen. They built the walls. They sounded the alarm. The thing that has made America unique in all of nations of all of history, it has produced the most free and prosperous nation ever in history. Not perfect. We had problems we had to deal with. We're aware of those. But it's because we look to God in his word as the source of truth, and we sought to build a nation upon it. God's watchmen were ever watchful, not only to build the walls, but to be on guard. This is what produced this nation in the first place. Now, as you are all aware, prayer is powerful. It does form the foundation of our individual life, but also form the foundation of our nation. Those leaders, those watchmen in early America, they took time to pray. Yes, personal prayer, but much more than that. From the very beginning, when the first permanent English settlement was founded, it was on April 29, 1607, that Reverend Robert Hunt came and they erected a cross at Fort Henry It's Cape Henry, right where the Chesapeake met the Atlantic Ocean, and he led the men in prayer, committing this land unto the Lord. You know, 10 years later when the Pilgrims came, they prayed. We have a day of national thanksgiving and prayer because of the heritage of these very devout Christian believers. The Puritans came with the same heart to pray. When they started the colleges and the universities, they recognized the foundation of prayer. Harvard is the first college. One of its original rules said, "And seeing the Lord only giveth wisdom, let everyone seriously set himself by prayer in secret to seek it of him." They prayed in secret, but they prayed corporately every morning, gathering together before they would launch out on their studies. And this was typical of all of the early colleges and schools and universities. In fact, prayer was the foundation of all 13 colonies. It was the foundation of that first Great Awakening, which we need one of those again today, as we all are aware of. And I love that first Great Awakening because it was then. Because God supernaturally moved through men like Edwards and George Whitefield, Samuel Davies, and others, beginning around 1740, he recognized there had been a lull in religion and he wanted to awaken the church. And so people began to pray, such that whole towns were even converted. Franklin relates in his autobiography concerning this time of the First Great Awakening. He said, "It seemed as if all the world were growing religious. So one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different parts in every hamlet." So it was so powerful that everywhere people were worshiping, were singing. Now, why is this significant? Because this formed the foundation that shaped the founders who gave us our nation. All of the founding fathers, except maybe Franklin, are young men at this time. And this environment that swept throughout the colonies with this powerful preaching of George Whitefield shaped their moral character, their worldview. And as they grew, they then took this faith and began to give birth to the new nation that we benefit from today. Many revivalist universities sprung out of that first Great Awakening. Princeton University, Columbia University, Dartmouth College, and many others, because they recognized we need to train godly ministers. Let's start colleges. And some of those earlier ones started for the same reason, but they had lost some of that fire, so they said, we're going to start some new colleges in order to do this very thing. So godliness swept the colonies, and that had a tremendous impact when we became a nation. And again, prayer was the foundation for the American Revolution and American independence as well. You may remember that in December 1773, we had a Boston Tea Party in protest against unjust action of civil government, where there was an attempt to do many things, including take their property without their consent. But in response to that, King George III declared on June 1st, 1774, the port of Boston would be closed, trying to squeeze out economically, cause Boston to submit to what he wanted to do. Now, what do you think was the response of the colonists? Well, interestingly enough, here down in Virginia, this man, Thomas Jefferson, who's the so-called great secularist who gave us separation of church and state, he was a member of the legislature. He authored a proclamation appointing a day of fasting and prayer. I don't know if you can read that day of prayer, of humiliation, fasting and prayer, where the people would gather together with one heart and mind to cry out to God, we're in a desperate situation, we need God's aid. This is Thomas Jefferson. And not only that, he recommended, and we're going to all go to church, the legislature. We'll go to church where we'll recommend everybody in Virginia. And so they did. It was powerful. Other states proclaimed days of prayer and fasting too. Later in September 1775, the first time the Continental Congress met together to discuss how are we going to deal with the tyranny that's taking place, what do you think they did? They prayed. Here's the first prayer in Congress. They invited Reverend Jacob Decay to come and open their proceedings in prayer. Here's George Washington and Patrick Henry, among others, who sought God in prayer. These are civil leaders discussing how do we deal with the desperate situation that our nation is in. It sounds familiar to today, doesn't it? And they sought God in prayer. John Adams was one of those delegates at this first First Continental Congress, and he wrote to his wife Abigail about this incident of this day of prayer. And he said, after this, Mr. Decay, unexpected to everybody, struck out into extemporary prayer, which filled the bosom of every man present. I must confess I never heard a better prayer or one so well pronounced. Episcopalian as he is, Reverend Decay was an Episcopalian, and it's kind of unusual for extemporary prayer for that to happen. And then he said Dr. Cooper himself, Dr. Cooper was his pastor, a Congregationalist, himself never prayed with such fervor, such ardor, such earnestness and pathos, and in language so elegant and sublime for America, for the Congress, for the province of Massachusetts Bay, and especially the town of Boston. It has had an excellent effect upon everybody here. Silas Dean, one of the members at this incident, he wrote, he said, Mr. Decay prayed without book about 10 minutes so pertinently with such fervency, purity, and sublimity of style and sentiment that even Quakers shed tears. This was not just a religious event because that's that way. It was in their heart. We need God's aid and assistance at this time. April 19, 1775, this was the day that the shot fired around the world took place. And it took place at Lexington Green, which was not really Lexington Green. It was actually the church lawn of this man, Reverend Jonas Clark. And those 8 people who were killed that were Minutemen were members of his church. By the way, black and white, fighting together, both part of his church at this time. And he said, from this day will be dated the liberty of the world. Not just America, but the world, because something unique was taking place in the birth of this nation. Now, April 19, 1775, a month before, the governor of Connecticut, his name was Jonathan Trumbull. Jonathan Trumbull was a minister. When that struggle for independence was taking, the people of Connecticut said, we know you're in the pulpit ministry, but we have other need of you. God, we believe, has called you to the civil ministry. Paul writes in Romans 13 that civil leaders are ministers. And so he answered the call. He served as governor of Connecticut throughout that revolution. In March 22nd, 1775, he said, look, we need to do something. Situation is serious, so he issued a proclamation that all the state of Connecticut would pray. There's a picture of the proclamation where he appointed a day of public fasting and prayer that God would graciously pour out his Holy Spirit on us to bring us to a thorough repentance and effectual reformation, that he would restore, preserve, and secure the liberties of this and all the other American colonies and make this land a mountain of holiness and habitation of righteousness forever. That God would preserve and confirm the union of the colonies in the pursuit and practice of that religion and virtue which will honor him. Now, do you know what day that he selected for them to be praying? I don't know if you can read it there, so I wrote it bigger for you. Wednesday, the 19th day of April, the very day the British fired upon the colonists, the day that shot heard round the world was fired. Who could have known but God that those incidences would take place on April 19th? Remember, this was back in March. The governor proclaimed, we're going to pray. We need to pray. God had a whole colony praying the very day this event took place. Only the living God that we serve could do such a thing. Now, I've only got a few minutes, and I'm even cutting it short, but I'm going to tell you more. We could talk, when you look at history, God is awesome. God moves throughout history to accomplish his purpose, as he did with the founders of America. July 20th, 1775, in response to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the king declared martial law. Well, I've had enough. I'm going to rule by the military. What do you think was the response of the colonists? The first colony-wide day of prayer and fasting, that on the very day martial law went into effect, July 20, 1775, the Continental Congress, united for the first time, said we're all going to pray. We recommend all of the colonies to gather together and for a humiliation, fasting, and in prayer, and again, just to cry out to God for his providential purposes. You know, they recommended Christians of all denominations to assemble for public humiliation, fasting, and prayer. There were 3 million inhabitants in the colonies at this time. It's estimated 2 million of them observed this first national day of prayer and fasting. These people were serious. They were watchmen. They prayed. You all know of Washington in the picture that we have on one of our books. America's providential history of his prayer at Valley Forge. And God, he not only prayed, but God answered that prayer. And unfortunately, I'll have to tell you these stories some other times. But he answered with miraculous physical supply of food, of help for training of the troops, of raising up a nation to become its ally. And what, again, do you think was the response? George Washington, in his official order, said, God has answered our prayer miraculously, and so therefore he set apart a day for gratefully acknowledging the divine goodness. He said, troops, all of you, we're going to gather together, thank God, because he's answered our prayer. So throughout the American Revolution, at the defeat of Burgoyne at Saratoga, one of the 7 most important battles in the history of the world, because it led to our France becoming our ally and us securing our independence, what do you think the Continental Congress did? They set apart a day of prayer and thanksgiving to be observed on the 18th of December of that year. And they recommended for everyone to confess their sins and humbly ask God through the merits of Jesus Christ mercifully to forgive and blot them out of remembrance. Again, these are not ecumenical prayers. They're prayers to the living God and his Son Jesus. At the discovery of Benedict Arnold's treason, the Continental Congress proclaimed the day of prayer and fasting. God has... And if you hear the story, you can see how God undercovered this treasonous attempt. The blackest die has occurred. And so they gave thanks, the whole nation at large. The Battle of Yorktown that ended the war. The Congress went to church and gave thanks to God for this incident. And Washington ordered his troops as well to set aside a day to give thanks to God, divine service, because he's given us this victory. And so our leaders, they were watchmen, they prayed throughout the establishment of this nation. Some of you may have been in the Capitol building, and then there's a little room set aside for prayer. It's not open to the public, but the focal point, here's the picture inside the room. It has an open Bible and a stained glass window with George Washington on his knees in prayer. Psalm 16:1 behind him said, "Preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust." Our leaders prayed. The common person prayed. Our churches prayed. The colonies prayed. They did it officially. They did it privately. Washington prayed for the governors. That was his legacy, his circular letter when he was closing up shop as commander. He wrote to them and he said, I make it my prayer that God would have you in the state over which you preside in his holy protection. And then he went on and talked about if we're going to make it as a new nation, then he recommended that they would imitate Jesus Christ, is really what he's saying. Do justice, love mercy, conduct ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion. Without a humble imitation of his example in these things, we can never hope to be a happy nation. And so we can begin to see, even Franklin, even that non-Christian Franklin, called the Constitutional Convention to prayer in June of 1787. God can even use these guys to, even the non-Christian, to stir us to our duty if he must do that very thing. And you all know, as President of the United States, George Washington appointed a day of prayer and thanksgiving to do that. In fact, again, this is not unusual. I have a book here, compiled by DeLoss Love, published in 1895, where he went and recorded all the fast and Thanksgiving days that he could find from 1620 to 1815 in New England primarily. Now, do you know how many days he has listed here in the back of this book? Civil governments at all levels, local, state, and then later national, beginning in 1775, he found over 1,400 times where civil governments proclaim days of prayer and fasting or prayer and thanksgiving. It has lists of all of these times. This is part of our heritage. This is not something, the National Day of Prayer has just made up in the last few decades. We've done this through our whole life, this very thing. And so Christians prayed, and this is where I'm closing, and this leads into my workshop and this course that we're offering free online in case you wonder if I was going to ever get there. They prayed, but they also acted. As you know, it's not enough just to pray. It begins in prayer. It begins with God powerfully transforming the heart and mind of men. That's how he transforms nations, but then we have duties. I love that word. Because duty implies you might not feel like doing it, and usually never do it. It doesn't matter. You do it because it's your duty to do. We have civil duties. The watchmen, God's people, must fulfill all of our duties to pray. And you know that. You know how to pray. And I commend you. I love to pray. But we then must act. We must do what God has called us to do. And thankfully, the early watchmen, the early Christians, they acted. They colonized the states, wrote the laws and constitutions, started schools and universities, served in leadership. In my workshops this afternoon, I'm going to give you examples of how they did that. They fulfilled their civil duties, and that produced the most free, prosperous nation the world has ever seen that we benefit from today. But it's our duty to pass on to posterity, our children, something better than we have. And we need to pray, but then we need to act. And that's what this course is all about. It's time for the watchmen to wake up, to sound the alarm, to fulfill their civil duties. And God is waking us to pray and evangelize, to educate, and to take action. And so each one of you got a little, one of these little flyers. It was in your notebook. And I would encourage you to take a look at it and read it, because it announces this free online course for ministry leaders being made available in 2011 to help equip you to fulfill your civil duties, to awaken the watchmen, to show us we have duties. How can we fulfill those duties? To teach principles of public life, to communicate the importance of churches, to have an ongoing training program within them to equip Christian citizens that know how to fulfill all of their duties. And for those who go through it, it's going to be 8 or more sessions and do some work. We will issue certificates to you, and we're going to make this course permanently available to anyone in the world to be able to take for free to help equip them, so that we can add the second part of we lay the foundation in prayer and then we act. And these are some of the sessions. 2 of these sessions in my workshop, which we're going to do here in just a minute, right after we grab our lunch, I am going to be covering in the workshop that I'm doing on the biblical basis for Christian civil duties and how Christians can fulfill their civil duties, looking at a lot of examples from American history. So be on the lookout. We will make this known and to you, available when we begin in February, March, somewhere around that time frame. When we begin to make this live, all you need to have is access to the internet, and probably we can work something out where you don't even have to have that if necessary as well. And as John mentioned, that this collaborative effort, well, some of our instructors, David Barton, you know, John, you know, some of you just met me today. I'm one of the instructors, Dean Nelson, Mark Beliles, or some of the individuals who will be teaching, and we may even have some folks from FRC participate in this as well. So thank you for listening to me.
You can learn more by ordering Worldview products, taking local or internet courses, or scheduling a speaker by contacting the Providence Foundation Biblical Worldview University.